It's sort of become a bit of one of my themes, really. As we watch the building take shape over there, as we watched for about 2 years and nothing happened. We had a vacant section and nothing happened. But I thought it's very appropriate to put that one highlighted, because that's the core of what we do, isn't it? He can. Yeah. And if we are to indeed be a house of prayer for all nations, that can only happen when we allow God to do his thing. So those of you who are keeping track of my messages may remember way back in 2017 that I did a message on the first chapter of Haggai, which I called Rebuilding Prophecy, and this is chapter 2 we're going to look at today. I've talked about it as good building, just because I like a pun, because the question is what we're going to build a good building? But there's also the idea that building is a process, and it's a process that needs to include all of us, so it becomes good building as we do it together. So there we go. If you like puns, there's your first one for the day. Okay. What do you see? Sorry? 2 faces and a vase. Hands up if you see the vase. Hands up if you see the people having a conversation. Hands up if you're clever and can see both. Well done. Isn't that interesting? Okay, those of you who can't see faces, can you see the faces now? You can? No. Now, one of these things gives me a pointy thing. Which one gives me the pointy thing? The green one. The green one. So there's the noses. There's the noses. There's the mouths. I think it's a pretty animated discussion. And then the black shape is the vase, just in case you didn't notice that one. Okay. So what do you see this time? A duck? It's a rabbit. Hands up who see the duck. Who sees the rabbit? Who can see them simultaneously? Okay. Do I need to show you where the duck and the rabbit thing is? Okay, so there's the duck bill. Yep. There's the rabbit's mouth and ears. Does that help? No? Rabbit's mouth and rabbit's ears? No. I may not be able to help you on that one. No. Okay, what do you see this time? Old lady and the young lady. Who sees the old lady? Oh, that's interesting. Who sees the young lady? Who doesn't see anything? Oh. There you go. So there's the old lady's nose. And that's also the young lady's chin. Yeah? Oh, well, I'll leave you to work that out. Let's move on to the next slide, which is it's a Trade Me ad. It's about what do you see? Or do I need to move that thingy on?
I'm so over this house.
I'm so into this house.
It's been completely untouched.
Completely untouched for 100 years.
For 100 years. It's like
stepping back in time.
I mean, just look at these tiny little doorways.
These tiny little doorways.
And the wallpaper.
Every day is an excuse to head to the hardware store.
Oh, and the pièce de résistance.
Oh, and the pièce de résistance.
The original long drop toilet.
The original compost toilet.
Very good. So, was that a good building? it depended on your perspective, didn't it? Yeah? And that's sort of what I'm thinking about as we think about, this year, as we watch the building taking place over there, and thinking about what's a good building. And I have this theory that what we see, our perceptions, our judgments, affects how we act, affects our attitudes and things like that. I think that's the reality, isn't it? And that's what that ad was demonstrating, that actually two people can look at the same thing and come up with completely different answers. And so thinking about the core buildings, and thinking about here we are in the present facilities, and we're watching something future happening. But I'm very aware that before this building, there was at least one other building that was housing the good people of this place. Yeah? There were two. Okay? So, can you tell us where they were? This one working? It's on?
The first building was actually in Rathbone Street, about where the Thai restaurant is now. Built in got to get this right, and it cost £274.
Woohoo!
In 1931, the Salvation Army purchased the old YWCA building in Rust Avenue, which is where the pharmacy is now. And we were there till 1979.
Right. Cool. So hands up if this is the only Salvation Army hall that you've known. There's a fair few of us who've only known this one. Hands up those of you who knew the Rust Avenue one. Cool. Any takers for the Rathbone Street one? No. Up there. Yes, indeed, up there. Yeah. So you guys who knew the Rust Avenue one, you carry some history. That those of us who are more recent imports don't have. That's important, isn't it? Yeah? Yeah, it's important. Because this core, both buildings and people, is past, present, and future. And those stories are important to remember. And so, I would imagine that for those of you who moved from Rust Avenue up to here, there was a mix of joy and sorrow, hope and fear in that move. I'd imagine there were a whole lot of significant events that happened down on Rust Avenue, that were both perhaps joyful and sorrowful.
Can I point out, for 1 year, we actually worshiped in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. While this place was being built, we spent 1 year sharing the facilities with the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Wow. Yep. And that's cool, isn't it? Good example of the fellowship. Yeah. But memories and expectations. And so, as we see this building taking shape, there'll be a mix of that going on and different levels of it. For those of you who've been here for a while, it carries some stuff from way down the road. And for those of us who have been here newer, there's not so much. But that makes an impact on, how we see things and what we see and what's important. So that got me to thinking about, I don't know, but in the Bible, the temple was a big thing, particularly in the Old Testament for the Jewish people that we sort of piggyback on. And so I wanted to spend a little time just looking at some of the events that surrounded the building and rebuilding of the temple in the Old Testament days, because I think there's some stuff we can learn as we transition, in a sense, from this temple to a new temple. Though, of course, the temple is all of us, people, more than buildings, but it's important. So 946 BC, I don't think any of us were around then, Solomon's temple was completed, and life carried on for a while. And the people of God did what people of God do, and they every so often forgot who God was and what that was all about. And so some 300 or so years later, Jeremiah starts speaking out about the state of the people's spiritual health and where it was. And from around 605 to 586 BC, the Babylonians with Nebuchadnezzar started taking out the leadership of the people of Judah and progressively over those times. But in time, the Babylonians got tired of the people, and they basically sacked the city. They destroyed the walls. They burned down the temple in 586 BC. And the people were taken off into exile for 70 years. There was a change of government. The Persians came into power, and Cyrus came to power, and they had a change of policy. They decided that actually, if people were happy back in their own country, they wouldn't cause trouble. So they allowed the exiles to return, and they started to restore the foundations. But that rebuilding effort stalled. There was opposition from the people who'd come into the land while they were away in exile, and there was reluctance on their part to get on with stuff because they were only surviving themselves. So that stalled. 520 BC, 16 years later, Haggai starts calling out and saying, hey, we need to get something going here. And then 4 years later, 516, the temple rebuild was completed. And I've put as a postscript that in 70 AD, the Romans came in and they destroyed the temple. So, interesting history of temple building. And you might think, why would we bother if that's going to happen? But that's another story for another day. Let's do some singing. So, here's a psalm that's reputed to be from Solomon and includes the famous little words, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labour in vain, which is a very profound and important thing to think about when we're doing a building, isn't it? And was important then. So this was Solomon who got the temple built, famous Solomon's temple, and his words, unless the Lord builds the house, the labourers build in vain. That's a very profound sort of statement, isn't it? That I think gives us an invitation to think as we look to build a new building, and as we think about who we are as a people building together, let's keep it central, doesn't it? He can. It's all about God. Yeah? It's all about God. Unless the Lord builds the house. So, as we contemplate a new building, we need to contemplate and make sure that we are praying that in our heart of hearts and in our actions, in our behaviour together, that the Lord is building the house. It's not just us. Yep. Let's fast forward a few years. How many years have we gone fast forward? We've gone 300 years or so. After the temple's built, and as I said, the people started wandering away in their faith, and things were getting dire. If you know your geography, the land of Israel is stuck between Egypt down south and Babylonia, Persia, Assyria up the top, and so it was always in the middle of some sort of skirmish going on, and every so often things happen. So at this particular time, the Babylonians were on top, and Jeremiah was sent to give a warning to the people. And it's interesting what he said. So the Lord sent me to the gate of the temple, like somebody standing out in front doors on a Sunday, when people come in to worship, and Jeremiah was instructed to go out the front doors of the hall and proclaim this message. And look at what he says. Change the way you are living and the things you are doing, and I will let you go on living here. Stop believing those deceitful words, we are safe. This is the Lord's temple. This is the Lord's temple. This is the Lord's temple. What's going on? They had come to rely on the fact that they had the temple of God in their midst. And they thought, nothing is going to happen to us. And people were telling them, nothing is going to happen to us. We have the Lord's temple here. And Jeremiah said, that's deceitful. That's wrong. if you're going to go on living in a way that doesn't honour God, you can't rely on the temple to save us. And, that was true for them. And did they listen to Jeremiah? No, they did not. And a few years later, the temple was gone. And I think that's a challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge to us to make sure that we're not reliant on the building to fix things. A new building will be lovely, and the new building that'll come over this bit eventually as well. But that's not going to solve anything if we don't do work on ourselves and make sure that we are seeking after God step by step. Yep. Yep. I think that's a good warning from history, isn't it? Just to make sure. Fast forward a few more years. So they've their temple, they've been away in exile, and they've been allowed to come back, and they've started restoring the foundations. And they've decided, a bit like we did 1 year ago, they decided to sort of have a blessing of the land, a dedication of the land. And so that's what they did. And this little snippet from the book of Ezra records that. And it's a very interesting little thing. Everyone started shouting and praising the Lord because work on the foundation of the temple had begun. And wasn't it a good feeling last year when actually something started happening on that piece of land? Yeah. It seemed a long time. And there were delays. Anyway, sorry, I interrupt myself. Many of the older priests and Levites and the heads of families wept bitterly. Wow. Because they remembered seeing the first temple years before. Yeah, all of those memories, eh? All those memories coming back. But others were so happy that they celebrated with joyful shouts. It's a bit like Christmas again, the Grinches versus the others. And I've been told I'm not allowed to call the others nutters. I mean, whoops. Yep, others were so happy they shouted with joy. The shouting and crying were so noisy that it all sounded alike and could be heard a long way off. But interesting. That would have been a fascinating thing to be a part of, wouldn't it? Yeah. And I'm imagining that at the dedication that we had a year ago now, there was a bit of mixed feelings going on. I'd imagine there was some of that going on. I didn't hear a lot of wailing and stuff like that. But we do things a bit more reserved sometimes. Yeah. But I thought the way we did that dedication day was a good one. Beginning with the Kaumatua blessing the land and ending with our own dedication service with the Salvation Army Band doing its bit. I think that was a good mix. A good indication of making sure it's a house of prayer for all nations. Yeah, that's cool. But they stopped. There was a pause on the project. 16 years worth of pause. Yeah. Opposition from external sources and probably their own reluctance and survival instincts meant nothing happened. Until Haggai and Zechariah started to do some prophesying. And this is the second message that Haggai did. So have a look at the book of Haggai. It's a really interesting little book. So we did the first chapter, as I said, back in 2017. I'm glad that you remember it so well. Yes. On the 21st day of the next month, the Lord told Haggai the prophet to speak this message to Governor Zerubbabel, try saying that one fast, High Priest Joshua, and everyone else. And what a great thing he starts with. Does anyone remember how glorious this temple used to be? Now it looks like nothing. Whoa, that's encouraging. Yeah, that's encouraging. Oof. Thank you for that, Haggai. You've got my attention. Yes. And I suppose all they were looking at was an expanse of dirt cleared and ready to start, but nothing else. And probably, like our section out there, by the time, it actually came for something to happen, a few weeds had grown up. The gorse, well, I don't know if they had gorse, but, who knows. That sort of happened. It wouldn't have been such a pretty looking thing that Haggai was pointing out. But it does get some good news. He says, even though it looks like nothing, cheer up. Because I, the Lord all-powerful, will be here to help you with the work, just as I promised your ancestors when I brought them out of Egypt. Don't worry, my Spirit is right here with you. Now that's good news, isn't it? That's good news. Yep. He's saying to them, even though it looks like nothing's happening and it looks like nothing compared to what we used to have, here's the good news. God's with us. Yep, God's with us. And that was cool. I think that's what they needed to hear. I, the Lord, all-powerful, will be here to help you with the work, just as I promised your ancestors. My Spirit is right here with you. Now I put down the bottom there, it's a conditional promise. What was the condition? They needed to do the work. Yeah. It wouldn't work if they just sat back and waited for God to do the work. This was their work. And so the encouragement was, as you guys get on with the work, God is with you. The Spirit is here. And I imagine that was encouraging for them. Yeah. I imagine that would be encouraging for us as we do the work of building together so that the new temple is filled and fit and doing its job. Yep. As the worship goes on there and then the work goes on anew in this space around here, won't it be good? Won't it be good if we can repeat these verses or believe these verses that the Lord all-powerful will be here to help you with the work? Yeah. Just as I promised your ancestors, those who were there in Rathbone Street, those who were there in Rust Avenue, those who are here, wouldn't that be good to know that God is on our side and that His Spirit is right here with us? That's powerful stuff, isn't it? Yeah. And we can't assume that. Yeah. We can't just assume that since we're building the building that God will turn up. We need to make sure that we are doing our very best to follow God's ways, to create a real fellowship that includes everybody. Yeah. That's part of the work, isn't it? Not just the building, but it's the work of relationship. And another part of that same conditional promise, which is interesting. And here it is. Soon I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake the nations and their treasures will be brought here. Now, going back into the history and the archaeology and all that sort of stuff, there's no evidence that there was actually an earthquake of any note around that time. But there were some interesting other things going on. Because soon after the Persians came the Greeks. And that meant a change of government. And things shook up for a while. And at the tail end of the Greeks, there was a brief period of time when the Jews had their own nation again. And then the Romans came and stuffed it up. Interesting. So there may not have been a physical earthquake going on, but there was some stuff going on, and things were changing. Yep. Carry on with this. Then the brightness of my glory will fill this temple. All silver and gold belong to me. And I promise that this new temple will be more glorious than the first one. I will also bless this city with peace. And in a limited sort of way, Jerusalem did have peace for some while, because the Persians left them to get on with things, And for the most part, the Greeks left them to get on with things. They did have a measure of peace. And then things went a bit haywire after that. But again, a conditional promise. You know, that promise that if they would do their part of it, then God would do his part of it. And I was thinking about that for us. And thinking, all of us gathered in this hall, our ancestors came from somewhere else. So in a funny way, God's already brought the treasures of the nations to this place. Isn't that interesting? Think of yourself as a treasure. Yeah. And from all nations gathered here. Yeah. To make a house of prayer for all nations. That's cool, isn't it? God does his work in interesting ways. And I think for us, as we contemplate a new building, this part of the promise is very strongly saying, if we trust in God and believe that God is with us, then God will provide what we need. Yeah? And the right people will come on board, and we'll all have that consideration that we want to make this a house of prayer for all nations. And I like the last sentence there as a bit of a promise and a hope for us today in Whangarei, that God will also bless this city with peace. Yeah? That would be so cool, wouldn't it? It's not just about us, but as part of our being a fellowship within the wider fellowship of all God's churches, that God would bless this city with peace. That's a cool prayer, isn't it? That's a good prayer for us to sort of buy into, isn't it? Then we'll fast forward another, 500 years or so, and here's Jesus. You may remember these words come from when he goes into the temple. By that stage, Herod's temple, which was a magnificent temple by all accounts, and could be said to be, the fulfillment of the prophecy where he talks about the temple will be more glorious than the previous one. And Herod's temple was pretty glorious by all accounts. But Jesus goes in there, gets rid of, knocks over the tables of the moneylenders and the animal sellers and other traders and other people who are cluttering up the court of the Gentiles. And this is what he says, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations?" Yeah, but you've made it a den of robbers. What a challenge. Yeah, what a challenge. Then, and for us now, to make sure that whatever else happens with the building that's going to be around us and over us, whatever else happens, the challenge and the opportunity is that we make sure that this is a house of prayer for all nations. And the prayer won't just happen in that auditorium bit over there. It'll be happening in this area with community ministries, with a bridge upstairs. All of it, a house of prayer. Because particularly the people who we minister to through community ministries and the bridge, and then they flow over into the Sunday stuff, is for a lot of these people, their world has been a den of robbers. And we want to make sure that we are not. Right. So, good building now. What we see shapes how we act. I want to suggest that we have a real opportunity to take up all of our memories and our expectations, the joys and the sorrows, the hopes and the fears, to take all of that up and offer it to God and say to God, we want to make sure this house is a house of prayer for all nations. Yep. I think that's the challenge and the opportunity that we have. Yeah, and as we watch the building taking shape over the next, hopefully not 16 years or even 4 years, but who knows? As we watch that building taking shape, we have the opportunity to make sure that in our working together, in our worshipping together, we are doing our level best to prepare a house of prayer for all nations. Okay. Thank you. I'll pass it over back to the music team.